We have been together since the beginning of time on this journey called the Bible of 40 Words. I asked you to behold a word every week, beginning with the wonder of creation through the wandering of God's people. I asked you to consider the guidance of the judges, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the lament of broken people. And now we've come to the end of the Old Testament on this timeline, to the birth of Christ, and we're ready to dive into the New Testament. But a few words a little bit before we do that. I want to give you some time to catch up, finish your stuff, your end of the summer stuff, so that we can all be together, or you can start again on this journey into the New Testament. So the period on the timeline between Micah, the last book of the Old Testament, and Matthew, the first book of the New Testament, represents a period of 400 years where no biblical material exists for us. And that's often been called the 400-year silence. God appeared to be silent for 400 years. And so what was happening in those years? Well, God wasn't silent. God never is. A lot of things were happening. There was the rise of a couple of other kingdoms. Greek and Rome came to power. And these historical events are really important for us who would know the Bible more, because the Greeks wanted everyone in the world to speak their language. And so for the first time ever, the whole world spoke one language. And so when Christ came, his story could be told in Greek and it could be spread around the world. Because the Jews were persecuted, they spread all around the Mediterranean and made these little pockets of civilization. And so when the first missionaries went out, Paul and others, they had places to start, synagogues to start. It made the spread of the gospel possible in a way that never would before. The other thing was the rise of Rome. That great power of Rome, they held their power with an iron fist. But what that meant was that the roads were safe and travel was safe, and there were roads, and so the gospel could go all over. So these things were very important in that time between the testaments. But here's the other thing. Writing didn't stop either. People were still writing. So God's story, God's people, God's covenant, the story was told in Hebrew, and the stories are collected in the Hebrew Bible. But soon people started writing in Greek. Around the time of Christ, after the birth of Christ, they were writing in Greek. And so it wasn't one book like this, but as I told you, more like a collection of scrolls that weren't in any particular order. And so what happened is, as these things started to be compiled and translated, there were these additional books, these 14 books that were being used by God's people, but they weren't part of the Hebrew Bible. They were Greek. And so they are what we now call the Apocrypha. So in our Bible, in our Protestant Bible, we don't have these 14 books, but the Catholics do use them. Other denominations use them, some of the Orthodox churches. So in the beginning, when we were talking about choosing a Bible, some of you asked about a Catholic Bible. It's just the same, but there were these other books that were written in Greek. And so what's in them? Well, a lot of the things that you've already come across. When you read the Proverbs, those collections of Proverbs, the book of Sirach has a lot of Proverbs in them, a lot of the same things. You read Ezra and Nehemiah, the call to rebuild the temple. And so there's a lot in there called Esdras, which is the Greek version of the name Ezra. And so some of the same, starting in the same story and expounding on that. We read Esther, Queen Esther, that was born for just such a time as this. There's more of Esther. We read Daniel. There's more stories that build on the time of Daniel. And so a lot of what's in the Apocrypha would be familiar to any of you that have come this far in the journey. And what Protestants decided, where most of us landed, is that these things are useful for study. These books help us. They're historical. One of the big things in the Apocrypha are the books of Maccabees. And that tells that history in those 400 years when the Jewish people were fighting for independence. And so it's important to the Jewish story, and it's important for our historical knowledge. So one of my study Bibles, actually my husband's study Bible, is a New Revised Standard, or a Revised Standard version, but it has the Apocrypha in it. So I want to give you a chance to keep up, to catch up, to get through Labor Day. And I'm going to be reading the Apocrypha. And let's see where God takes us. Next week, we'll have a new word. We've been through 28 words. And now we'll begin Matthew and the Gospels with some more words. So come back. Happy reading.